The envelope sat on Margaret Chen's desk like a coiled snake. It was cream-colored, expensive, the kind of stationery that whispered old money and older power. Her assistant had placed it there an hour ago with trembling hands, mumbling something about it being delivered by a courier from a family's legal team in Singapore. Margaret knew what it was before she opened it. She'd been expecting this for 3 months, ever since her youngest daughter Catherine had whispered the truth over afternoon tea at their estate in Vancouver. "Mother," Catherine had said, her voice barely audible over clinking of fine china, "I saw the succession documents. Father's name is the only one that matters. Yours isn't even listed as a co-trustee." Now, Margaret's perfectly manicured fingers, nails painted in her signature shade of burgundy, slid the documents from the envelope. Her eyes scanned the dense legal language, but she didn't need to read every word. Catherine had been right. 43 years of marriage, for children raised, countless business dinners hosted, relationships cultivated, crises managed behind the scenes. And according to these documents, Margaret Chen had exactly zero formal authority over the Qin Dynasty Holdings, a conglomerate worth, at last valuation, $497 billion. The empire spanned shipping, real estate, technology, pharmaceuticals, and renewable energy across 14 countries. It employed 340,000 people. It held contracts with governments and kings. And it all rested on one man's signature. Her husband's, David Chun. Margaret set the papers down and looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows of her private office, a room in the east wing of their 40,000-square-foot estate. The Vancouver waterfront glittered below, and somewhere out there in the Pacific, 47 cargo ships bearing the Qin logo were crossing between continents. She had helped David choose the logo. She had named 3 of those ships herself, but she couldn't control a single one. The phone on her desk buzzed. David's personal line. "I assume you received the documents." His voice was calm, measured, always measured. It was one of the things that had attracted her to him decades ago, his unshakable composure. Now it made her want to scream. "I did. And I'd like to discuss why my own name appears nowhere except as a beneficiary, like a child, or a mistress." Silence on the line. Then, "Margaret, we've been over this. The corporate structure has been in place for 20 years. Changing it now would create tax complications, succession uncertainties. I don't care about the structure, David. I care that you can make billion-dollar decisions without even informing me. I always inform you. Informing is not the same as require my consent." Another pause. "What exactly are you asking for?" Margaret's reflection stared back at her from the darkened window. A woman of 65, who could pass for 50, her silver-streaked hair pulled into an elegant chignon, her posture impeccable from years of ballet training as a child. "Joint signing authority," she said, "on everything above $100 million. I want my signature to carry the same weight as yours." The laugh that came through the phone was soft, almost pitying. "That's not possible." "Make it possible." "Margaret, you're being emotional. We'll discuss this when I'm back from Shanghai next week." "No!" She cut him off, her voice ice. "We'll discuss this now. I'm calling an emergency board meeting. I still have that right as majority shareholder spouse, don't I? Or did you write me out of that too?" She hung up before he could respond. Her hand was shaking. In 43 years of marriage, she had never hung up on David Chun. She had also never declared war. The Chun family compound in Vancouver consisted of 7 buildings spread across 12 acres of waterfront property. The main house, where Margaret and David lived, was a modernist masterpiece of glass and stone. Surrounding it were smaller estates for each of their 4 adult children, a guest house, staff quarters, and a building everyone called a vault, the private family office where the real decisions happened. Margaret stood in the vault's main conference room 3 days later, waiting for the family board to assemble. The board consisted of David herself, their 4 children, David's younger brother Thomas, and 3 longtime family advisors. It took a majority vote to overrule David on major decisions, though in practice, this had never happened. Margaret had spent the past 72 hours changing that reality. Catherine arrived first. At 32, she was the youngest, and Margaret had always thought The most like her, sharp-minded, politically astute, impatient with her father's patriarchal assumptions. Catherine worked as the head of the family's philanthropic foundation, a role David considered appropriate for a woman, but which gave Catherine access to the same financial networks David used. "I'm with you," Catherine said simply, squeezing her mother's hand. Next came Marcus, the eldest at 41. He ran the Asian operations from Hong Kong and had his father's temperament, cautious, traditional, risk-averse. Margaret had assumed he would side with David, but Marcus surprised her. "I've been thinking about what you said, Mother, about partnership, about respect." He adjusted his cufflinks, not quite meeting her eyes. "Jennifer has been asking me why she isn't more involved in the Hong Kong office. Why her MBA from Oxford doesn't count for as much as my experience." I didn't have a good answer. Jennifer was Marcus's wife. Margaret made a mental note to send her a very expensive gift. The twins, Elena and Christopher, both 37, arrived together as always. They co-managed a North American real estate portfolio and had always been difficult to read. They operated as a unit, sharing an almost telepathic bond that left even their parents outside their decision-making process. "We need to discuss something first," Elena said. Margaret's stomach tightened. "Of course." Christopher pulled out a tablet. "If you and Father go to war over this, the stock price will drop. Our partners in the Tokyo development will get nervous. The Singapore regulators might reopen their questions about the shipping subsidiary structure. We could be looking at $40 to $60 billion in value destruction in the first quarter alone." "I'm aware of the risks," Margaret said quietly. "Are you?" Elena's eyes were hard. "Because we spent 10 years building the real estate division. If this turns into a public fight, it won't." Margaret's voice was firm. "I'm not trying to destroy anything. I'm trying to fix a fundamental imbalance that should have been addressed decades ago." The twins exchanged a look. Then Christopher nodded. "Joint signing authority on deals over $100 million. That's all you're asking?" "That's all." "Then you have our support," Elena said. "But Mother, you need to win this cleanly. Quickly. If it drags out, we'll have to reconsider." 4 votes. Margaret, Catherine, Marcus, and the twins counted as 5 votes. The twins shared 1 voting share. She needed 6 for a majority. David entered then, returning from Shanghai earlier than expected. He moved with the contained energy of a man who had built an empire from his father's modest shipping business, who had turned $5 million into $500 billion over 4 decades. He was 68 but looked younger, his face angular and sharp, his suit custom-tailored in Milan. He nodded to each of his children, then looked at Margaret. "I'd like to speak with my wife privately before we begin." "No," Margaret said. "Whatever you have to say, you can say it here." His jaw tightened. For just a moment, she saw something dangerous flash in his eyes, the same look he got when a rival company tried to undercut a chin bid, or when a government official made the mistake of asking for a bribe. Then it was gone, replaced by his usual calm. "Very well, let's begin." David's brother Thomas arrived next, followed by the 3 family advisors. Richard Lau, the chief legal counsel who had been with the family for 30 years, Victoria Zhang, the CFO, and James Park, who managed government relations across Asia. Margaret watched them take their seats. Richard and Victoria she was uncertain about. They were loyal to the family, but ultimately deferred to David. James, however, she had cultivated carefully. She had introduced him to his wife, had sponsored his children's education, had made sure he understood that the family in family business included her. David called the meeting to order. "I understand there's a proposal on the table," he began. "Margaret wants to restructure our signing authority. Before we discuss this, I want to remind everyone what's at stake." He clicked a remote, and the wall screen behind him illuminated with a cascade of financial data. "Our current structure has produced an average annual return of 23% for 20 years. We've weathered the 2008 crisis, the pandemic, 3 separate regulatory investigations, and 2 hostile takeover attempts. We've done this because our decision-making process is streamlined, efficient, and clear. One person has final authority. One person the market trusts." He looked around the table. "Introducing joint signing authority creates ambiguity. What happens when Margaret and I disagree? Do we deadlock? Do we delay billion-dollar time-sensitive deals? While we argue, do we signal to the market that the Chin family leadership is divided? Catherine spoke up. Or do we signal that we're a modern organization that values partnership and diverse perspectives? David smiled indulgently. Catherine, I value your mother's perspective. I consult her on every major decision. Consulting isn't control, Margaret said softly. And I noticed you didn't consult me on the Singapore mineral rights purchase last month. $340 million, David. I read about it in the Financial Times. A muscle in his jaw twitched. That was time sensitive. We had a 48-hour window. You had time to call the lawyers in 3 countries. You had time to structure the purchase through 2 subsidiary corporations. You didn't have time for a 10-minute phone call to your wife. The room was silent. Marcus cleared his throat. Father, I think the question is reasonable. If Mother had joint authority, would it actually slow down our operations? Or would it just mean you'd have to make one additional phone call? David turned to his eldest son, and Margaret saw genuine surprise on his face. He had expected Marcus to be his automatic ally. It's not about phone calls, David said, his voice tight. It's about liability, responsibility, and legal clarity. Victoria, explain the tax implications. The CFO opened her folder, but before she could speak, Margaret slid her own document across the table. I've had 3 independent tax attorneys review a proposed restructuring. It can be done with 0 tax impact. In fact, there are some advantages related to estate planning that we've been missing. Victoria glanced at the document, then at David, then back at the document. I would need to review this more carefully, but at first glance, this appears viable. David's composure cracked slightly. You had outside attorneys review confidential Chin family documents. I had attorneys review a hypothetical structure. And yes, David, I use outside counsel because I apparently can't trust our inside counsel to give me advice that isn't filtered through you. Richard Lau shifted uncomfortably. Let's vote, Elena said abruptly. We've heard both sides. Mother wants joint signing authority on transactions over $100 million. Those in favor? Margaret raised her hand. So did Catherine, Marcus, and the twins. 5 votes. Margaret looked at James Park. Their eyes met. She saw him glance at David, then back at her. I abstain, James said quietly. Margaret's heart sank. An abstention helped David. He only needed to prevent a majority against him. Victoria and Richard sided with David, as expected. Thomas, David's brother, reluctantly raised his hand for David as well. 4 votes for David, 5 for Margaret, 1 abstention. The math was close, but not close enough. Then Catherine spoke again. There's one more voting member who hasn't weighed in. Grandmother. The room froze. David's mother, Madam Chun, as everyone called her, was 91 years old and rarely attended board meetings anymore. She lived in the compound's guest house with round-the-clock care, but she retained a single voting share from the original family trust, a relic of the business's founding structure that no one had bothered to restructure because she always voted with David when she voted at all. Mother is not well enough to participate in board decisions, David said firmly. I visited her yesterday, Catherine replied. She seemed quite sharp to me, and according to bylaws, any voting member can participate remotely if they're unable to attend in person. Catherine pulled out her phone and dialed. Moments later, Madam Chen's face appeared on the wall screen, replacing the financial data. She was tiny, bird-like, but her eyes were bright and alert. Grandmother, Catherine said formally, we're voting on whether Mother should have joint signing authority with Father on major decisions. Do you understand the question? I'm old, not stupid, Madam Chen said in Mandarin. Catherine translated for those who didn't speak it fluently. David leaned toward the camera. Mother, this is an internal matter. You don't need to trouble yourself. Be quiet, David. The old woman's voice was sharp. Margaret, this is what you want? Equal signature power. Yes, Madam Chan. The old woman was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, when David's father was alive, We built this business together. He negotiated with the ports. I managed the money. He bought the first ships. I kept us from going bankrupt 3 times. Everyone called it Chen's business, but it was ours. Both of us. She looked directly into the camera. When he died, David took over. That was right. He was the eldest son. He was ready. But I noticed something. He never asked for advice. Not from me. Not from his wife. He thought asking was weakness. She shook her head slowly. A man who cannot share power cannot keep it. I vote with Margaret. The screen went dark. The room was absolutely silent. 6 votes to 4. Margaret had won. The legal restructuring took 6 weeks. Margaret hired her own team of attorneys, and for the first time in their marriage, she and David sat on opposite sides of negotiating tables. He fought her on every detail. The $100 million threshold was too low. He argued it should be $500 million. Margaret held firm at $100 million. She should only have signing authority on North American deals. He suggested. Margaret insisted on global authority. The restructuring should phase in over 3 years. Margaret demanded immediate implementation. At night, they slept in the same bed but didn't speak. The silence in their private quarters was arctic. The children watched nervously. The staff whispered. And in the financial press, rumors began to circulate that something was happening inside the Qin Dynasty holdings. Share prices wobbled. Partners started calling with routine questions that weren't routine at all. Elena had been right. The conflict was creating uncertainty, and uncertainty was destroying value. Finally, 8 weeks after the vote, the restructuring was complete. Margaret Qin became co-signatory on all transactions exceeding $100 million. The board announcement was carefully worded to sound like a natural evolution of governance rather than an internal power struggle. The market stabilized. The whispers quieted. Margaret had won. But the victory felt hollow because she could see what was happening in her husband's eyes. The man she had married, the man who had courted her with poetry and promised her partnership, was gone. In his place was someone cold, calculating, and deeply, dangerously angry. 3 months after restructuring, David presented a major opportunity, a chance to acquire a struggling European pharmaceutical company for $12 billion. The company had valuable patents and a strong pipeline, but was drowning in debt. It's a steal at this price, David said at the board meeting. We can restructure their debt, monetize the patents, and flip the whole company for $20 billion within 18 months. Margaret reviewed the documents. Everything David said was true. It was a good deal, but something nagged at her. Who's representing the sellers? She asked. Rothschild and Company. Why? And who's financing our acquisition? A consortium of banks. The usual players, Deutsche Bank, HSBC, Credit Suisse. Margaret pulled up something on her tablet. Interesting, because the seller CEO is on the board of Deutsche Bank, and his brother is a managing director at HSBC. David frowned. So the banks financing our purchase are closely connected to the people desperate to sell us this company. Don't you think we should ask why they're so eager to get this off their books? We've done our due diligence. Have we? Margaret looked at Richard Lau. Richard, did we get access to their pending litigation files? The attorney hesitated. They said those were privileged, and we accepted that. It's standard in these negotiations. No, Margaret said firmly. It's standard when you're in a hurry. I want a full litigation review before I sign anything. If they won't provide access, we walk. David's face darkened. This deal closes in 72 hours. If we delay, we lose it. Then we lose it. Margaret, you're being paranoid. Am I? Or am I doing the job you spent 40 years excluding me from? She refused to sign. David raged. He called her unreasonable, emotional, risk-averse. He tried to restructure the deal to come in under $100 million, which would have been obvious manipulation, and the family lawyers advised against it. Finally, furiously, he demanded the litigation files from the sellers. They refused. The deal collapsed. 2 months later, that pharmaceutical company, declared bankruptcy. It turned out they were facing $8 billion in liability from a drug that caused heart problems. The lawsuits had been carefully hidden in a web of subsidiaries. If David had acquired the company, Chin Dynasty Holdings would have inherited those liabilities. Margaret had saved them from an $8 billion disaster. David didn't thank her. He didn't even acknowledge she'd been right. Instead, he started looking for other ways to win. Margaret began to notice irregularities in April. Small transactions, each under $100 million, flow into a network of subsidiary companies she didn't recognize. Individually, they were beneath her signing threshold. Collectively, they totaled billions. She brought it to the board meeting. "What is Chim Pacific Ventures?" she asked. "A subsidiary focused on Southeast Asian opportunities," David replied smoothly. "And Chin Maritime Holdings Ltd., Shipping Operations Restructuring, and Chun Technology Investments GmbH." A pause. "Venture capital in the European tech sector." Margaret pulled up a chart sheet had Victoria's team prepare, though Victoria had been reluctant to provide the data. These 15 subsidiaries have received $6.7 billion in transfers over the past 4 months. None of them require my signature because each transfer is structured to stay under $100 million. David, you're routing around the authority structure we agreed to. I'm using subsidiaries for their intended purpose, operational efficiency. You're deliberately avoiding joint authority. I'm avoiding unnecessary bureaucracy. Marcus spoke up. "Father, what exactly are these subsidiaries investing in?" David smiled. "I'm glad you asked. We're building a next-generation container port in Vietnam. We're acquiring lithium mining rights in Chile. We're funding an AI startup in Berlin that's going to revolutionize shipping logistics. All opportunities that require fast movement and confidential negotiations." He looked directly at Margaret. "Opportunities we would have lost if I'd had to get committee approval for every decision." Catherine leaned forward. "But, Father, that's exactly the point of joint authority. Major strategic decisions should involve both of you. These aren't major strategic decisions. They're tactical executions of our existing strategy." $6.7 billion sounds strategic to me, Margaret said quietly. The argument went in circles. David was technically within the legal structure. The subsidiaries were properly chartered. The transactions were below the threshold. But he was obviously violating the spirit of their agreement. Marcus suggested lowering the threshold to $50 million. David threatened to resign from the board. The twins calculated that a resignation would crater the stock price by 30%. They deadlocked, and David kept routing money to his shadow empire. Margaret discovered the second betrayal in June. She was in Singapore for a foundation event Catherine was hosting, and she decided to make an unannounced visit to the regional headquarters, a gleaming tower in the Marina Bay financial district that served as a hub for the Asian operations. The receptionist looked panicked when Margaret stepped off the elevator. "Mrs. Chan, we weren't expecting. I'll call Mr. Chen's office." "That won't be necessary. I'm just stopping by." She walked past the receptionist before the woman could stop her, moved through the familiar corridors toward David's Singapore office. She'd been here dozens of times over the years. The staff knew her, but they were looking at her strangely now, with pity. She found out why when she opened the door to David's office and saw her husband with his arms around a woman young enough to be his daughter. They sprang apart. The woman, barely 30, beautiful in a crisp business suit, looked terrified. David looked caught. "Margaret, this isn't..." "Isn't what?" Her voice was surprisingly calm. "Isn't what it looks like? Isn't the reason everyone in this office has been looking at me like I'm pathetic? It's not like that." "How long?" "Margaret." "How long?" The young woman. David introduced her as Lin Wei, his executive assistant in Singapore, fled the office. David and Margaret stood facing each other across his desk. 2 years, he finally said. 2 years. Margaret did the math. It had started long before the signature authority fight, long before the board vote. "She is why you need the Singapore operation to be independent?" Margaret asked. "Why you spend so much time here? Why you needed those subsidiaries I can't see into?" Lin Wei has nothing to do with business decisions. Don't lie to me, David. Not anymore. Is she on the payroll of one of your shadow companies? His silence was answer enough. Margaret felt something break inside her. Not her heart, that had been fracturing for months. Something else. The final thread of partnership, of respect, of whatever had once bound them together. I want a divorce, she said. David actually laughed. No, you don't. Excuse me? You want to hurt me. I understand that. But you don't want a divorce. Do you know what a divorce would do to this company? The legal battle over asset division would take years. Every subsidiary, every contract, every asset would be in play. We destroy everything we built. You've destroyed it already. I've made a personal mistake. It doesn't have to affect the business. Everything affects the business, David. You taught me that. She turned to leave. If you file for divorce, David said, his voice cold, I'll fight you for every penny. I'll tie up the assets so thoroughly that the company will collapse before you see a settlement. The children will have to choose sides. The employees, the partners, the banks, everyone will be forced to pick either you or me. Is that what you want? Margaret looked back at her husband. She had loved this man once. She had loved his ambition, his brilliance, his drive. She couldn't remember what that felt like anymore. I want, she said quietly, what I've always wanted. Partnership, respect, equality. Then you married the wrong man. Margaret didn't file for divorce. Instead, she went to war. She started using her signing authority to block everything David tried to do. Every deal over $100 million came to her for approval, and she demanded comprehensive reviews, independent audits, third-party assessments. She slowed the company's deal flow to a crawl. David retaliated by moving even more money into a subsidiary network, building a parallel organization that didn't require her approval. The twins were right. The conflict was destroying value. By August, the company's stock price had dropped 22%. Major partners were reconsidering their relationships. 3 senior executives quit, citing internal instability. The children were caught in the middle. Marcus tried to play peacemaker, shuttling between his parents with compromise proposals that neither would accept. Catherine stood firmly with Margaret, which created a rift with her father that might never heal. The twins withdrew into their real estate division and stopped taking calls from either parent. And Madame Chun, the grandmother whose vote had started it all, passed away in her sleep in September. The funeral was a cold, formal affair. Margaret and David stood on opposite sides of the grave. The business world watched and calculated what the split meant for the future of Chun Dynasty Holdings. At the reading of the will, they discovered that Madame Chun had left a letter. Richard Lau read it aloud to the family. To my children and grandchildren, I am old and I am tired and I am disappointed. I thought teaching David that marriage is partnership would save this family. Instead, I lit a fire that consumed us all. Pride is destroying what 3 generations built. Someone must have the wisdom to stop. If you cannot share power, you do not deserve it. Divide the empire before you destroy it. The room was silent. She's right. Elena said finally, we need to divide the company. Absolutely not, David snapped, but Marcus nodded slowly. An orderly division is better than watching this slowly collapse. Father takes the Asian operations. Mother takes North America and Europe. We split the rest proportionally. We'd be worth half as much separately, David protested. We're already worth half as much, Christopher said quietly. We've lost $110 billion in market value since this started. At least a split would stabilize things. Margaret looked at her children, exhausted, caught between warring parents, watching their inheritance crumble. I'll agree to a division, she said, on one condition. Everyone turned to her. Joint custody of all the children's projects. Marcus's Hong Kong operations, the twins' real estate, Catherine's foundation. They stay independent, funded equally by both sides. This divorce is between David and me. We're not destroying our children's futures. For the first time in months, David looked at her with something other than anger. Maybe respect. Maybe just exhaustion. Agreed, he said. The division took a year to structure. It was brutal, complex, and expensive. Teams of lawyers worked around the clock to untangle 40 years of integrated operations. Assets were appraised, debts allocated, partnerships dissolved and rebuilt. In the end, David took Qin Dynasty Asia, the shipping operations, the ports, the Asian real estate, the Singapore headquarters. It was valued at $210 billion. Margaret took Qin Dynasty Global, the pharmaceutical divisions, the North American operations, the European holdings, the technology ventures. It was valued at $198 billion. Together, they were worth $408 billion. $408 billion. $89 billion less than the company had been worth before Margaret demanded her signature rights. The remaining value had been consumed by legal fees, lost deals, departed partners, and market uncertainty. The business press called it the most expensive divorce in corporate history, even though Margaret and David technically remained married for tax purposes. They simply never spoke. On the day the division was finalized, Margaret stood in her new headquarters in Vancouver, smaller than before, but entirely hers, and looked at the papers that gave her complete control of Qin Dynasty Global. She had won. She had her independence, her authority, her equal signature power, but she had no partner to share it with. Catherine found her there, staring out at the harbor. "Mother, are you all right?" Margaret thought about the question. Was she all right? She had spent 43 years fighting for recognition. She had finally forced the world to acknowledge her as an equal, but in doing so, she had destroyed her marriage, split her family, and reduced a $500 billion empire to rubble. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Was it worth it?" Margaret turned to face her youngest daughter, Catherine, who had started this all with that whispered truth over tea. Catherine, who was brilliant and capable and would never let a man control her future. "For you," Margaret said. "Yes. You'll never have to fight this battle. You'll never be written out of your own legacy. So yes, for you it was worth it. But for you?" Margaret looked back at the harbor, at the ships bearing the Qin logo. Half of them now belonged to David's fleet. "For me," she said quietly, "I don't know if when it was worth the cost of fighting." 2 years after the division, Margaret's phone rang at 3 a.m. It was Marcus, calling from Hong Kong. "Mother, father's had a heart attack. It's serious." She was on her plane within an hour. Singapore General Hospital's VIP wing was quiet when she arrived. Her children were already there. Marcus looking exhausted, Catherine tear-streaked, the twins holding hands like they used to as children. "He's stable," the doctor told her. But it was significant. "He'll need surgery, and then months of recovery. The stress has been—" The doctor trailed off diplomatically. They all knew what the stress had been. Margaret went into David's room alone. He looked small in the hospital bed, attached to monitors and IVs. His skin was gray. He had aged a decade in 2 years. His eyes opened when she sat down. Margaret, David. They looked at each other for a long moment. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "For Lin Wei, for not listening, for everything." Margaret felt tears on her cheeks. "I'm sorry too, for being so stubborn, for not trying harder to compromise, for letting it get this far." "You weren't wrong," David said quietly. "You deserved equal authority. I should have given it freely instead of making you fight for it. I should have trusted that we could work together instead of assuming we were enemies. We were good partners once, weren't we? The best." David closed his eyes. "What did we destroy, Margaret? Everything we built. Was it worth it?" The question she'd been asking herself for 2 years. "I don't know," she whispered. "I wanted equality. I got it, but I lost us. Can we—" David's voice was barely audible. "Can we fix it? Is there anything left to save?" Margaret thought about the divided empire, the fractured family, the $89 billion destroyed in their war. She thought about 43 years of marriage and what remained of them. "I don't know," she said, "but maybe we can try." She took his hand. Outside the window, Singapore was waking up. Somewhere in the harbor, Qin Dynasty Asia ships were preparing to leave port. In Vancouver, Qin Dynasty global operations were beginning another day. Two empires, where there had been one. Two damaged people, where there had been partners. But they were still alive. They still had their children. And they were finally, truly, equals. Maybe that was enough. Maybe it had to be. The merger announcement shocked the business world. Qin Dynasty Asia and Qin Dynasty Global were recombining into a single entity, Qin Dynasty United. Margaret and David would serve as co-COOs with genuinely equal authority. Marcus would become COO. Catherine would head global strategy, and the twins would manage the combined real estate portfolio. It wouldn't restore what had been lost. The 5-year separation had cost them opportunities, market share, and over $100 billion in value that would never be recovered. But it was a beginning. At the press conference, a reporter asked Margaret, "Do you regret demanding equal authority all those years ago?" Margaret looked at David. He looked back. "I regret how we fought," she said. "I regret what we lost. But I don't regret standing up for equal partnership. That was right. I only wish we'd been wise enough to build it together, instead of tearing everything apart to prove a point." "And you, Mr. Chun?" The reporter turned to David. "I regret," David said slowly, "being too proud to see that sharing power would have made us stronger, not weaker. My wife was right. It took me too long and cost us too much to admit that." They signed the merger documents together. 2 signatures, equal weight, partners again. It wasn't a happy ending, but it was, perhaps, a wiser one.